I looked up how to do a podcast. And they say the first principle or law of podcasting is to engage your audience. I also found out that there's some people in my audience that are in sales that are listening and watching. So just for you, I'm going to talk a little slower and a little simpler so you can follow along. Let's get to it. Welcome. Another episode of IBF On Demand. I'm Eric Wilson, the maker and breaker of laws. Send me your questions, comments, your glowing praises to eric@ibf.org, eric@ibf.org. We have the sponsor, Arkiva, your one-plan S&OP software solution. They follow all the laws of supply chain and it can help you out with your supply chain solution. Remind you, there is a book I've heard of called Predictive Analytics for Business Forecasting. You can find it here. So check out that. It's for the next generation of demand planning 2.0 is what they've claimed it. I've taken on that as the mantle. It's an exciting book. Check it out. Exactly where we're going as an industry, where we're going as a field, some of the next practices in demand planning that you need to know now to be prepared. But first, I want to take a step back because I recently heard, talking to someone about the recent book wonderful book. They enjoyed it, but they say we're confusing some of the people in the field. They're hearing a lot of different things about, should they be doing time series modeling? Should they be doing this? And there's a lot of information that's just confusing demand planners right now. So I want to take a step back in this podcast today. I want to talk about the basics, demand planning, forecasting, predictive analytics. Whatever you're looking at, it is as much of art, but it is also a science. There is some fundamental basics that we need to ground everybody on so there's less confusion going forward. So I don't care if we're looking at my book, Predictive Analytics for Business Forecasting. I don't care if you're talking about demand planning, forecasting, whatever you're doing, there are some foundational things that I think we need to talk about. Because a lot of times this is what we overlook. This is a lot of times what we forget. And this is what we need to consistently remind ourselves. We need to uncomplicate things, me included. I'm the blame here as well. Let's uncomplicate these things. Get back to the fundamentals, get back to the foundation, and talk about where it is everything begins with. Everything that is done has some basic founding principles that really guide it. We want to define business forecasting, demand planning, predictive analytics. We must define exactly what those principles or laws that guide it are. These are the specific ways that we apply the art and the science and the limitations or resultants. It referred to as the laws. So this, I went up on the hill, I came back down, I'm bringing back down the 5 basic laws and principles of business forecasting for you today. These are the principles that must be in front of our eyes every day. These we must look to as planners and remind ourselves and most likely remind others and executives and salespeople as well as we go forward. So with that, these are the 5 laws of business forecasting, demand planning, predictive analytics as I see them. Love to hear your feedback, what you see as the most important laws and principles. Let me know if there's anything I forgot. But as I see it, here are the 5 laws of business forecasting going forward. Law number 1, forecasts have some inherent uncertainty in them. I know most places you look at, you're going to see on top of the list, the forecast is always that word. I don't like you. Go back, check out my podcast on why we need to stop saying the forecast is always wrong. I don't like that terminology. I'm not going to say that the forecast is always wrong. My principle is that the forecast have some inherent uncertainty in them. They're not expected to be 100%. Forecasts are based on statistical probabilities. So with that, it's a probability. And it's not my fault that people don't understand probabilities. It's not my fault the executives and others don't understand probabilities and call it wrong. That is the inherent uncertainty in it. Errors are inevitable and are expected. So with that, we need to communicate those errors and communicate that uncertainty to others. We need to be able to let people understand why it's not wrong, why it might not be precise, but we can still be accurate in what we're telling and the insights we're providing. I said, real quick synopsis of that one podcast. I said, we're doing our own harm to our industry the more and more we keep saying forecasters wrong. Not only that, but it's bad on my, it hurts me every time I hear it. You know, my ego needs a boost, and you're going to just tear my ego down every time you keep telling me I'm wrong. So to help perpetuate the field and improve it, we need to start using the right language. And the right language is there is inherent uncertainty. Errors are inevitable. They need to be expected. So we need to be able to communicate those accordingly. We need to understand with that there is some products that may be harder to forecast. I mean, obviously new products, shorter life cycle items, things that have a lot of disruptive forces into them, things that have fickle consumers involved with them. Just talked to someone, got off the phone right before this podcast in the medical device field, talking about how hard it is because they have outside influences of the government influencing when is something can come to market, when something can't. And they may have the perfect forecast, and then all of a sudden they have something saying, no, you need more trials, you need more this. Trying to forecast that with that external factors in place as well. Some products are harder to forecast. Understanding those and understanding which items you can forecast better than others. It's important to measure the forecast accuracy and take action in constantly to improve it. We shouldn't be satisfied with just saying that errors are inevitable. We should be striving to consistently take out that uncertainty everywhere we can. Being able to understand, demand, understand patterns, and try to take as much of that uncertainty out. We need to work on our processes and not accept we're not perfect, but continue to strive to become better. We need to identify the forecastability, understand things like COV, coefficient of variation, or demand variation index, DVI. Understand those, how they relate to items, find the items that may be in our portfolio that are harder to forecast. Look at segmentation to be able to segment items and being able to look at items that can and can't be forecasted efficiently and effectively. And as I mentioned, once you get down to this, once you understand your items, once you understand your segmentation of it, once you understand and you're continuously trying to improve, it goes back to, though, that there is inevitable some uncertainty that still will exist. Communicating that and to others so they understand that uncertainty that exists as well, so they can include that uncertainty in their planning. Provide an estimate of error. Provide that estimate of uncertainty, that probability. Start explaining that to other people. To understanding this first law, that forecasts have some uncertainty. No matter how good a job we do, it's still going to have some uncertainty with them. Explaining that first law to everybody makes it better for not only from you from my planning, so you're continuously improving upon it, but it makes other people that are utilizing your forecast understand that so they can plan better and understand some of that uncertainty as well. Brings us to law number 2. In the absence of actuals is bias. unless you have the truth sitting in front of you that you know is 100% the truth, an actual. Outside of that, barring an actual number that is occurring, you're going to have some bias. So not only do you have uncertainty, but the absence of actuals is bias. There are generally three sides to every story. And there's generally three sides to every forecast. There's your forecast, there's the person interpreting it, and then what actually is going to occur. You're going to have bias. You're going to have bias in what inputs you create in data. You're going to have bias in the different judgment that you're adding in from different other functions. You're going to have bias in your process. You're going to have bias in how you think the forecast should be created. And you're also going to have bias in the person receiving the forecast and maybe how they interpret that forecast as well. Absence of actuals, bias exists. I love this saying. I love this quote that I got from a few years back. It says, ignorance occurs when the outcomes are not known or predicted. Uncertainty occurs when the outcomes are known or predicted, but the probabilities are not. Risk occurs, or I would say bias occurs, when the probabilities and outcomes are thought to be known. That is our bias. That's what we're trying to eliminate. Our goal with forecasting is two things. Provide the best signal with the least amount of error and the least amount of bias. We already talked about striving to eliminate that most of uncertainty as we can. And ultimately, we know there's still going to be some exist. The other thing we need to do is try to eliminate as much bias as we can, understanding some may still exist as well. One of the best ways to eliminate the bias is start to understand what some of those biases are. Be aware there are natural biases between each function. Sales. Sales is going to have your own bias. I did a whole, hour-long podcast, lecture once on how to speak sales and talking the language. And I really broke down some of the biases that exist, both on the way we communicate and the way they communicate. And I may bring that back as a podcast one day on how to speak sales. But one of the things we talked about as the natural bias with sales is most generally you can have a situation where they're going to over forecast because they keep getting beaten up because you don't have the inventory. Even though you're creating this forecast as it's supposed to be unbiased, unconstrained, they know that they can drive inventory a lot of times if they're adding in bias. So they intentionally or unintentionally are creating this bias to be able to drive a signal downstream so they have the inventory necessary. It could be driven times because of optimism. You want optimistic salespeople. You're talking about, you thought our job was bad as far as getting beaten up because the forecast is wrong. They get beat up every day hearing no, 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 just to hear that one yes. So you need an optimistic salesperson in that role. That optimism sometimes can bleed into what do you think is going to happen next week, next quarter, next month. It can bleed into sales perspectives that maybe have bias in them as well. At the same time, I've also seen the flip side of this. We're setting the budgets for next year, or we're setting targets because you have a one number planning, which you should. Sometimes sales will say, okay, I don't want to put everything in. I just want to put in what I'm sure about. And ultimately, it comes out to becoming a bias because they end up not intentionally or sometimes intentionally padding their numbers or not putting everything in so they can hit their targets easier. And that's just from the sales. We can look at finance from a perspective as well. Finance may have their own biases as well. They don't want to put in anything that they don't know is going to happen. And they end up not putting in some projections that ends up becoming biased to an ultimate plan. They're looking at numbers and they want to really generate a number that's going to fit the financial projections that they want to get, whether it be increasing revenue or decreasing revenue. which then ends up increasing or decreasing. They create targets that they then want to push a unconstrained forecast more to align to. So sometimes you have those biases within finance. You can also have executives as well. Executives, you can have the same exact thing play out with executives that really push forecasts in one direction or another and add bias. Ops may have their own bias as well. They're getting beat up all the time because they have too much inventory. Lower your forecast, or they're tired of getting beat up because they don't have enough inventory. Raise your forecast, because they understand that signal is driving what they do. And there's not that decoupling between demand and supply. Without that decoupling, you end up with bias sometimes coming from operations as well. So there's a lot of functions, marketing, product, a lot of inputs you have into your forecasting process that can add bias into it. Real quick, talking about marketing and product, new products, you're talking about optimistic. You're never going to find a more successful product than before it launches, talking to marketing and product management. You have to filter some of those biases and understand those natural biases exist. But I want you to look at yourself as well. We have bias in our data. We have processes in our processes. We have biases in our process. We have biases just in what we do. We have the black box where we accept what the statistical algorithms and the models are putting out, and we accept them at face value. There's a black box bias there. There's the anchor bias that can occur, where executives or somebody else saying, hey, I think we're going to sell more next month, 10% more. Guess what? Going into your process, you have that already anchored in your thought processes. When you're putting together your inputs, putting together your outputs, you already have that anchor you're tied to without even realizing it. You have the confirmation bias that then can occur as this is what you thought's going to occur. Guess what? Something pretty close to that ends up occurring. Complexity bias is another big one. We have this a lot of times in data science where we think if we can make something more complex, it has to be more right. And we lose sight of the biases that may be interjected with data, with other types of complexity we're adding in the model. We may be adding in bias opposed to making the answer less bias. Law number 3, thou shalt not, or as we're talking, as granularity increases, noise decreases. This may be common sense, but we need to keep understanding this from a basic principle, because guess what? This goes into every aspect of predictive analytics, data science, anything you do, this same principle applies. If we can understand this foundation early on and keep reminding ourselves of this, it helps. But also it helps other people who may not be in our fields to understand this principle then as well. As granularity increases, noise is going to decrease. A good analogy for this is the easier it is to forecast the overall demand for a signal for a type of cola versus forecasting for specific configurations of that soda, such as cans, bottles, packaging. You can look at it from a clothes standpoint as well. I forecast a shirt, it's going to be much easier than if I forecast the size and color of that shirt. As your granularity increases, as I go up in aggregation from an item to a size to a family, as the granularity increases, my noise decreases. And what this means is my noise, that's my uncertainty a lot of times in what I'm planning. Noise or randomness in the data generally is going to be my uncertainty. So as I can decrease that noise, I'm going to be able to improve my forecast. And one of the ways we decrease noise is to increase your aggregation. So noise or randomness is generally going to decrease as my aggregation levels increase. i.e. the higher level of aggregation, the lower the noise and the less uncertainty I'm going to have. Aggregation can be across a lot of different things too. I'm not just talking a family level. I'm talking about an item level. I'm talking about location aggregation. I can aggregate at a location level. I can aggregate at a customer aggregation. I can look at time as aggregation. If I'm looking at my forecast every hour, it's going to be a lot more noisy than if I batch these into daily or batch these into weekly type of demands or batch this into monthly. So the more I can aggregate, the less noise, the better my forecast is going to be. Now, ultimately, though, we're trying to provide the best signal possible with the least amount of error and bias is what we're going. So our job, best signal possible, least amount of error, least amount of bias. We have to understand that best signal part as well. Because I could just forecast on a monthly basis at the company level. There's very little noise at that level, and I can forecast that most likely pretty darn good. The problem, though, is my customer, internal customer, may be supply chain, which has to build an item. They're not building a company. They're building an item. So I need to provide them the best signal possible. And forecasting at that higher level is not giving them the signal they need. So I need to go down to the lowest level of aggregation possible with the least amount of noise to provide them the best signal with the least amount of error, and don't forget the least amount of bias as well. So that's what you're trying to accomplish. It becomes the balancing act now that you're doing. But the principle still applies. It's a signal to noise ratio you're looking at to try to find the best signal with the least amount of noise. That's what you're looking to be able to accomplish and create with this. So apply the principle, start looking at this. You may not be able to get down to an hourly item location customer level. That may be way too noisy. You may have to start looking at aggregations coming up, looking at different ways you can aggregate this so you still have the best signal, but then you start having a signal you can actually forecast because the noise is starting to be dampened because of your level of aggregation. So start looking at those things. You can also look at, we mentioned the item, location, customer, time, so on and so forth. It's okay then. One of the things I recently talking to someone, one of the on trainings we were doing, was the question about seasonality. Can they look at seasonal profiles at a family level and then look at the profiles down below and forecast an item level and then add the seasonal profiles for new products? And the question was on new products. And I said, yes, if you have a new product, let's say the apparel business, and you have a new product, you can create ratios for size, color, looking at forecast at an item for the family level, and then go up even higher level for a category level to understand the seasonality profiles, and then add that seasonal index back in. So now I have a middle out type of profile that I'm forecasting at a family level. That's the best level that I can get the best signal to noise type ratio. I'm using ratios down below that to then apply my color, my size. And I'm using a ratio or index above that for seasonality and applying that back in. That's how you need to look at that. I'm applying this principle to be able to figure out what I can do from a seasonal profile, what I can do from a color ratios, what I can do from a forecasting an item level or family level, and putting all these pieces together. Number 4, the closer to actual demand, the better the forecast is. And this actually has a couple different implications here. This principle. The closer to when the sale or predicted sale, there's less potential noise. So what I mean pretty much is if I'm going to forecast tomorrow, it's going to be a lot easier than if I tried to forecast next year, same day. The closer to when the sale or predicted sale, the less potential noise. This is obviously the closer the actual demand, the better the forecast. Long-range forecasts are more susceptible than shorter term to unexpected events, to noise occurring. This is the reason why if I'm forecasting tomorrow, it's a lot better than if I'm forecasting next year, same time. It also means, though, that the closer to true demand, it provides less distorted signal, less potential noise in it as well. And you're getting closer to what the consumer actually wanted. So the closer to true demand, the same principle applies. The closer to actual demand, the better the forecast. So closer to when the signal occurs, or closer to when actually true demand, which is actually when the signal occurred to the sale occurring. Either one of these occur. And what you're trying to do then is being able to take away, once again, that noise, the potential distorted signal that occurs. Because the further you get away from when actually true demand occurred, the more distorted the signal will happen. This is a bullwhip effect occurring here. As we look at the customer when they bought it, then when the retail store actually orders it versus when the when this signal is actually going to come because they're batching, all this is a distorted signal by the time you get it. Then if you looked at an order compared to when a shipment history is, there's a distorted signal there as well because of constraints, because of timing, because of batching and things of that sort. So the more time and distance you're getting in between when the sale occurred and when you're getting it, the more distorted signal you're going to get. The same applies to when you're forecasting it. If I'm forecasting something happening tomorrow, there's a lot less chance something's going to occur between now and tomorrow that's going to affect that, whether it be consumer, external factors, internal factors. There's less distortion in that. So the closer I am to that signal, the easier it is going to be to forecast that. If I'm looking out forecasting 5 years from now, that signal may be right now, but by the time I get there, there's a lot of distortion that can occur between now and then. So you're cutting down the distortion in the signal is what you're doing here based on this principle. So the closer to actual demand, the better the forecast is. This can be closer to the actual forecast and time you forecasted it and when the actual sale, purchase, signal occurred. Either one plays into this principle here. And that's principle number 4. And the final principle, number 5, forecast improve with the more you know. Sounds logical, but we tend to forget this sometimes. We can look at this sometimes as the law of large numbers. It's a central role in probability. And remember, we're talked about forecasts is a lot about probabilities is what we're doing. The law of large numbers plays as a central law of that. It states that if you repeat an experiment independently a large number of times, the average of the results is going to be closer to the actuals. So think about this in what we're doing. This variation applies to our business forecasting as well. When we look at data, I'll be careful with data though. Don't assume that we throw a whole bunch of data that's going to be better on that. But at the same time, as we look at more inputs, as we look at things that actually, add value to our process, we could actually get a better picture as we provide more inputs into the process. So be careful you don't have more inputs and you're not as far as being able to overfit the data, multi-collinearity, things of that sort. So be careful. That's a topic for another day, another principle. Just keeping the 5 basic principles. We can improve our signal the more we know about what we're forecasting, the more we know about the consumer, the more we know about why something occurred, the more inputs we can understand the true drivers of our forecasting, the better forecasting we can provide. We also can look at this as far as the modeling we use and inputs we use as well. Think of the jelly bean principle. Okay, the jelly bean principle is the more guesses, the closer to the mean. I mean, pretty much you're looking at the law of large numbers. As we repeat an experiment more independently, more times, we drive towards an average, the results, which is closer to the actuals. When you're looking at that same type of principle playing out, when you're looking at inputs, looking at modeling type situation, as you look at it from multiple different ways, multiple different inputs, you can actually drive closer to the actual correct answer. And it's by any chance anybody doesn't know what the jelly bean principle is, if you take a jar of jelly beans, and I should have had one here on my desk, when you're looking at a jar of jelly beans and you get multiple guesses, everybody's going to be maybe far off. You got some outliers in there. All the guesses together on average is going to be pretty close to what's in that jar. Looking at our collaborative process, one person may not have the answer, including you, because you have bias as well. Including your system, because it may have bias as well. Including this ideal model you may put together, because it may have bias in the data and the model itself. So one person may not have the answer. But from a collaborative process, the more we get and the more we work on understanding the drivers and feeding in inputs, the better we can get to the actual answers. This is why it's important in our field: collaboration, consensus, going towards a one number, building models that are ensemble type models, which look at multiple different inputs and multiple different models put together. Those are the ones that win the day. Collaboration is what wins the day, because forecast will improve the more we know. The final law of podcasting: we've come to an end of another, and the forces of time are against us, and the length of your attention span is probably working against us at this point as well. So I'm going to have to bring this one to a close. I am Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org, eric@ibf.org. Keep in mind the third law of podcasting: every action, which is a like, share, subscription, there's an equal and opposite reaction, me continuing to do this. So please continue liking, sharing, subscribing, and we'll keep providing content for you. Go over more foundational things and more advanced things going forward, bring on some great guests. I said you can find me at eric@ibf.org. I want to thank Arkiva, your one-plan S&OP software solution. And when it comes to principles, I think one of the most important principles out there, don't forget, wash your hands.